Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us in such large numbers. Today, we're diving into a critical change that will impact you, the merchants. Visa's new Acquirer Monitoring Program, or VAMP, a program that is starting next week on the 1st of April 2025. Just so you know you're in the right place, this is what we're aiming to cover in the discussion today: what VAMP is and how it changes fraud and dispute monitoring, the new VAMP ratio and enumeration ratio and why they matter, and we'll also share some best practices for staying compliant. I'll be your facilitator today. My name is Tatiana Crisan. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at FlexPay. I've been specialized in payments for several years now, but I'm always surprised by how much there is left to learn. One of the people that has taught me a lot is Jeff Pauletto, our VP of Innovation. His research is instrumental to the success of the merchants who choose to recover failed payments with FlexPay. Welcome, Jeff. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jeff Pauletto. I'm here as the VP of Innovation here at FlexPay. I have been in payments more or less for about 20 years now, 10 of which here at FlexPay. I take care of, most of my day-to-day involves taking care of the machine learning models and the recovery phase for our core business, but also an important part of what we believe in here at FlexPay is making sure that we're good stewards to the merchants that we do business with. And so that means I have to stay up to date with any regulatory changes, any best practices, and making sure that our merchants know how to best run their business. And we're here to support them with that.
Perfect. So as you can tell, this is a live webinar, so we're very excited to have you join us. And please ask questions. We can see them as they come in, and we'll address them as they become relevant for the topic we're discussing, or there will be a dedicated Q&A time at the end where Jeff will be answering all your questions on VAMP or anything else you would like to cover. So drop them in the chat in the Q&A section. And before we jump into VAMP, Jeff, can you tell us some of the ways you were able to collect the information that you'll be sharing with us today? There seems to be very few credible sources. So how did you do that?
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, certainly going to Visa's own websites or some other websites out there. I know Count has a good article on it. I think Chargeback 911 has a good article on it. There's a fair bit of resources online of people giving their take on how they see things. Like some of you out there, I was at MRC last week in Vegas, or rather the week before, and there was certainly a couple of talks about VAMP and how it's going to change people's businesses. Part of the issue going on, though, is that a lot of the rules in VAMP are kind of still in progress. They are being worked on. There have been changes that have been made. A couple while I was at MRC, one as early as yesterday, as they continue to make updates on this to make sure that they want to improve the payments ecosystem, but at the same time they don't want to make it too onerous for merchants. So they are making changes, and we'll go over what some of those are.
Right. They pushed back the time in which they will start fining, so that's good news already, right?
That's it. Yeah.
Great. So let's start by breaking VAMP down. First off, tell us more about the name. So the name is focused on acquirers. Why should merchants care about an acquirer monitoring program?
Yeah, so Visa's trying to make this kind of a unified system, whereas before they had several different systems to monitor the performance of merchants in terms of fraud, in terms of chargeback, in terms of really risk. Visa's trying to take a different approach to this. Instead of having to go after the merchants themselves, they're renaming VAMP as the Visa Acquirer Monitoring Program. They're trying to refocus on judging the acquirers, because ultimately those are the ones giving out merchant accounts to some of the bad actors out there. And if they can hold the acquirers accountable, then hopefully the idea is that the acquirers will then hold the merchants accountable. It makes it a lot easier for Visa to manage. It makes it so that they can be a bit more strict on the enforcement, because Visa enforcing all of these things for a merchant, it's a little bit more indirect. But if it's the acquirer doing it, the acquirer really has a vested interest because they have a lot more stake in the game.
Right. And sometimes we heard some merchants that weren't necessarily walking the path of the good steward, as we recommend. They say, oh, well, we're too small for Visa to notice. So do you think this would change?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's really happening is that the limits for risk tolerance at the acquirer level is really coming down. So overall, we're talking about 0.5% for all fraud and all non-fraud combined for the acquirers. And that's just a start. By next year, it'll be coming down to 0.3%, which is really quite low. Any merchant in the card not present space would have a tough time competing with 0.3% in terms of chargeback and fraud. Thankfully, there is a secondary limit for merchants themselves, which is going to start off at 1.5%. That is also coming down to 0.9% by next year. These are going to be challenging. For card not present, you're always going to see chargebacks. You're always going to see some risk, and it's not always your fault. I mean, we all are aware of friendly fraud, the case where a customer signs up to a thing. Maybe they didn't really understand that it was a recurring business. Maybe they just wanted to cancel and didn't know how. A lot of reasons, but those, when they turn into chargebacks, are really going to hurt the merchant. So we're going to have to be very, very careful as an industry on how to deal with these things. Now, one thing that has changed recently, just so everyone is aware of the updates on this, there are systems like RDR and CDRN that help manage and mitigate your chargebacks. If you're not aware of them, by all means, look into them, because it's going to be very important to minimize the number of chargebacks you're getting. But RDR and CDRN are still going to count towards your VAMP ratio if it's a TC40. A TC40 is just a fancy Visa term to mean an actual fraud. But if you get an RDR or a CDRN that wasn't fraud, it was just basically a friendly fraud, it won't count to your ratio. So originally they were going to count everything, and then maybe they were going to count nothing. Now it's just the actual fraud for RDRs and CDRN, and that's an important distinction for people that are using those.
Jeff, we already have a question from our audience. Thank you so much, Megan, for asking this question. So can you please explain these percentage changes again, she asked. So can we take a step back? So you mentioned chargeback ratio. Is this the same as the VAMP ratio? Take us through it.
Yeah, so how it's going to be counted is, as a merchant, your initial limit is 1.5% as your VAMP ratio. What that means is add up all of the dollar values of the fraud and non-fraud disputes that you get. Add them all up and divide that by the total approved sales you ended up having. That is the ratio where you have to stay below 1.5%. So again, there's been similar programs in the past, but before it had fraud as a different aspect, and it had chargebacks as a different aspect, and it also had count of chargebacks as a metric at different levels of volume. Now it's really just saying, just add up all of your fraud and non-fraud disputes, divide it by your total sales count, and that has to say below 1.5% for this year and below 0.9% next year.
Hey, we have a great audience today. So Yusuf is wants to know more about the thresholds for acquirers. He asks, most of the acquirers are already below the 30 BPS threshold, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, that's fair. A lot of acquirers are below that threshold. So again, the threshold for this year for acquirers is 0.5%, and then 0.3% next year. And for those that maybe aren't sure, acquirers are going to be basically the merchant account provider. So if you're using something like Checkout or PaySafe or Adyen, think that. A lot of them could be under 30 basis points, but the catch is that for a lot of these acquirers, they have a lot of very, very good traffic that is maybe not card present, maybe not card not present, probably card present, that has very low risk. And what they have tended to do is they tend to load in some much higher risk business because they can charge that higher risk business a lot more in terms of transaction fees, processing fees, a lot of these things, because high risk businesses have trouble finding homes for their traffic. And so acquirers can certainly stay under 30 basis points, but they're going to have to cut out that highest risk business, which actually is very, very profitable to them. So it's still going to be tough for acquirers because they don't make a lot of money on the very, very cleanest business. They make a lot of money on the higher risk business. But this is how Visa is choosing to come down on them as well. And I think it kind of makes sense because Visa sees this. Visa sees that, okay, you basically have two types of business, the super clean and then the high risk. Let's try and focus on the high risk. How can we do that? The acquirers are making too much money off of it.
Okay, so there will be a balancing act basically on staying compliant and then also making revenues. I just wanted to highlight, we do have a guide where we cover the ratios, so both the VAMP ratio and the enumeration ratio. So you can just download that guide. I'll remind you again at the end. We have another question from Seb. Thank you for joining, Seb. Are the thresholds 1.5% on a per mid basis? Just to give a bit of background for Seb's question, because he works in a company where they have a lot of different merchants.
Yeah, so it's mostly going to be on a per mid basis. Ultimately, if you have multiple merchant accounts at the same acquirer, they're probably going to group you together and look at you together unless it's really separate businesses. If ever there is cross-contamination of merchant accounts, so for example, if you're cascading transactions from one merchant account to another, it's very likely that those will get linked and those will get treated the same. If you have merchant accounts at completely different processors, they're not going to be treated the same way. It's going to be really at the acquirer level. And again, Visa's limits are really coming down on the acquirers, and they're kind of leaving up to the acquirers on how to bring down the hammer to the merchants. Now, Visa does have fines associated with being outside of these thresholds, but ultimately, again, it's up to the acquirer to decide how hard they want to come down on you. If you are a merchant at 5% chargeback ratio, but you're doing $1,000 of transactions a month, they're probably not going to care too much. It's really going to be up to the acquirer to say, like, how much is this impacting the acquirer's business, and what do they want to do about it? So to go back to your ultimate question, it's mostly on a per mid basis, but if the mids are at the same acquirer, the acquirer may choose to group them together anyways.
Great. So that seems to be all the questions on this topic. So we just wanted to cover the enumeration ratio as well specifically. When we first came across this, it kind of looked familiar, like almost like an authorization rate that we thought would be included in these monitoring programs. But then after you went to MRC, you've learned more about it. You found that there is a distinct difference about this. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's actually something that wasn't brought up in great detail, and I found that the resources on it aren't as focused on it for some reason, and maybe that's okay. It's less of a immediate concern, but I think it's still something that people should be aware of. So the VAMP enumeration ratio, enumeration to Visa it basically is another word for card testing. So they want to find merchants that are allowing card testers to test on their system. What that means is, are you allowing some random person at 3 a.m. to try 5,000 transactions in 10 minutes with a bunch of different cards? So it could either be a bad actor that is just trying random card numbers and seeing what might work based on some algorithm, or one that maybe bought a list of stolen credit cards and wants to see which ones are working, holding a charge. It's definitely a problem in the payments ecosystem. Nobody actually wants this to happen. The problem is that if you're a small merchant, oftentimes you kind of say, well, it's unlikely to hurt me, and even if it does, it's onerous to deal with this problem. Well, VAMP is trying to address this a little bit. So their initial threshold, so this is just the what's launching on April 1st, is to say, well, if 20% of your transactions are these card testing attacks, then you're going to go on a monitoring program, because clearly there's something that needs to change about this. What's particularly interesting about this, and I found it very, very interesting. I don't think Visa's done something like this before. They're counting these attack transactions whether they approve or not. So if you have 1,000 transaction attempts and you decline them all, well, if they got declined because they got sent to the bank and the bank declined them, they count against you. Now, again, 20% of all of your sales volume is going to be a fairly high threshold to reach at first. But this is Visa's initial testing of this program. 20% is not how it's going to stay. It's certainly going to go down over time. What's important too is that this is, they've also set a fairly high barrier on the minimum number of attacks you might see. So I believe they've started at 300,000 enumerated transactions. So again, enumerated is just Visa's term for card testing. You have to breach 300,000 card testing transactions before they will come after you. It's a very high barrier. Not many merchants will see that much volume, but it's going to come down over time for sure. And in all honesty, it's something that every merchant should be having some system in place well before Visa takes a look at you anyways. A really good example was just a couple of months ago, I was doing a data analysis for one of our customers. They were thinking of joining FlexPay. They sent me some data. And I was very confused at first because I was looking through the data and I could see, okay, they're maybe doing 50 transactions a day, 100 transactions a day. But then on one day in particular, between about 3 and 4 a.m., they had just short of 10,000 transactions. Almost all of them failed. Go figure, it was a card testing attack. They got hit. They didn't really notice at the time. They didn't even know when I went to them with the results what I was talking about. I had to show them in the data. No, look, it's clearly happened. And very disappointingly for them, it lined up very well with a significant drop in their approval rates. Approval rates, as I'm sure everyone out there knows, is so critical to keeping a business alive. I believe they were already having some trouble. They were already about 68, 70% upfront approval rate on their recurring transactions. By the end of the time period that I was looking at, which was about 6 months, they had dropped to about 40% approval rate. They were desperate to know what they can do about it. The problem is that at that point, it's too late. You can't keep a recurring business going at a 40% upfront approval rate. That merchant account is going to be tainted for years. There's very little you can do to save it. The only suggestion at that point is basically like close things down for that line of business and try and open up new merchant accounts and start over. This time with a tool that can analyze that an attack is coming, that is happening, and can block it. There's lots of fraud detection services out there. I can't recommend enough that everyone needs to be using something, because it's it's becoming nearly a requirement now for people in card not present. Like I said, the chargebacks are already so high for so many merchants. You need to be doing something to block those signups that are fraud and block those card testing attacks.
Jeff, Megan wants to know, how will Visa confirm that transactions are actually card testing?
Yeah, they have been a little bit vague with how they do it, but they have a system in place that partially uses AI and partially uses just a rules-based system. But they go through transactions for merchants and they look for anomalies. If you're seeing 1,000 transactions go through in an hour when a merchant normally does 100 in a day, that's pretty easy to spot. That's the catch, is that a lot of these are fairly easy to spot, in all honesty, because let's say you're someone who is a bad actor and grabbed a list of stolen credit cards. Time is of the essence for you, because if you did that, that list of stolen credit cards is probably in the hands of 100 other people right now, and they're all trying to get stolen goods with it. So they want to test out these cards as fast as possible to move on to actually, buy a TV or buy $1,000 of gold to get delivered, or buy like something else, something of value. And so these attacks generally happen in a very short time period, and Visa is pretty well positioned to be able to see when that happens. Like I said, they don't give out the exact details of how they do it because they don't want to give clues to the bad actors on what they're looking for, but it's not that hard to find.
So it's likely the pattern that's clustered and very intense and out of the ordinary compared to their usual traffic. Okay, so when we first started looking into this, we weren't sure if, let's say, merchants with excessive retries would be confused for an enumeration attack. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, Visa is very well positioned to identify these. And there's a big difference between, especially for merchants in the recurring space, between doing retries on their customers versus someone trying out bad cards. Off the bat, yes, you'll see a lot of declines on both sides, but it doesn't take much to look under the hood and see how it's different. The easiest of which is to see is that all of the recurring transactions are all MITs, merchant-initiated transactions. Those have a very low risk threshold. They have a very low chargeback likelihood. Those are not the kind of transactions they're looking for. They're looking for the customer-initiated transactions, because those are the ones that indicate that there might be card testing or something else going on.
Okay, so Megan just had a follow-up, right? So it sounds like they are focused on the bulk credential stuffing activity versus trying to aggregate one-off. So that's kind of, would you agree with that? It's
yeah, that's it. Absolutely. They want to make sure that that you're not allowing an attack of 20,000 credit cards to be tried in 5 minutes on your system.
And then we have another question from Yusuf. Do you think Visa will change their mind for including RDR alerts related to fraud in the VAMP ratio?
That's a good question. Okay, so Visa has said that fraud in an RDR will be counted towards VAMP.
Sorry, Jeff, what is an RDR for those of us that are not familiar? Just
that's it. I don't want to get too far into it, but RDR and CDRN are ways to get alerts for incoming chargebacks, so you can try and do something about it before it turns into a full chargeback, or it's kind of a chargeback mitigation program. And it's run by Visa and Ethica, and these are great services, but the idea is that if this alert that comes through turns out to be a fraud alert, it's going to count against you in your VAMP ratio. I don't think that Visa is going to move off of that. So Visa at first said, if it's an RDR alert, we won't count it. If it's a CDRN, we won't count it. They've come back from that position and said, well, actually, if it's fraud, we will count it. I think 100% of the time they will include fraud in all of their metrics. It doesn't matter how you're trying to ameliorate it. If it was an approved transaction that turned out to be fraud, it's not really your fault. It's hard to catch all of them, but it's going to count against you because they want to find out the merchants that are getting the most of these fraud attacks, and ideally have the merchants do something about it.
Okay.
And one other note I wanted to mention on the changes that Visa has made on this. At first, Visa had announced a 1-month sort of grace period. So April was going to be a sort of a testing period. They would launch it, but there would be no fines, there'd be no issues. They bumped it up to 3 months, and yesterday they bumped it up to 6 months. So for the next 6 months, there will be no fines associated with this directly from Visa. That doesn't mean that your acquirer can't fine you, and that doesn't mean that you still won't be flagged. You will absolutely be flagged if you're above these thresholds. You will be notified. Visa and or your acquirer might still want proof that you're doing something about it, but there will be no direct fines. Obviously, the fines are pretty substantial when they happen, but even more importantly, a fine is nothing if your merchant account is at risk. And that's really what it comes down to. Once again, it's always up to your acquirer if they want to keep your business or not. And so even if Visa is giving a grace period, the acquirers will start watching this fairly closely. And so I would say act as if it is turning on April 1st, and make sure that you have a plan to keep your VAMP ratio down.
Cool. So we're close to coming to the end. So what advice do you have for the merchants that joined us today? What are some best practices that they could go back with and start implementing to prepare for this?
Yeah, the most important, for sure, without a doubt, it's having some sort of risk mitigation tool on your side. There's a lot of them out there. I would say if you have one connected into your CRM, it's not enough in all likelihood. External third-party companies exist for a reason that only do this. So I'm thinking of things like Count or Sift or Forder, but there are dozens of others. Ultimately, even using a bad one is a lot better than using nothing at all. The hardest part you're going to have is you're going to have to say it's okay to say no to some signups. That's always hard to do as a merchant. It's always hard to say, like, okay, well, let's block 5% of the people trying to sign up to our product. But you have to appreciate that the risk liability of accepting that highest risk portion is what will kill your business. Fraud is a poison in the payments ecosystem, and having something to block it is really important. And conversely, if you are being a good actor, if you are blocking those bad transactions and you are trying your best to make sure that only good, legitimate transactions are getting through, what's going to end up happening is, as your chargeback rate goes down, as any of these metrics go down for you, banks see this. Banks have insight into this because they know who you are as a merchant, and they know how many transactions you've sent to them. If you're sending them a lot of good transactions, welcome to the payments ecosystem, which is perpetually self-reinforcing. If you send through a lot of good transactions, issuers will treat you better. If you send through a lot of bad transactions, issuers will treat you worse. Approval rates are the lifeblood of a recurring business. And so whenever you are a good actor and banks can see it, you will see your approval rates go higher than the average. And ultimately, that's what it gives you a competitive advantage as well. If you are able to get a 90% upfront approval rate on your recurring business, that alone is putting you probably in the top 10% for recurring businesses out there. But it also means that your LTV for your customers is just going to get longer and longer. The most painful part about recurring businesses is constantly losing customers because of failed payments. Keeping that approval ratio up means that you can avoid that failed payment from happening in the first place. And that's so important for a business. There's really nothing more important than that.
Great. We're coming up to time. If there's any other questions, please pop them in the chat. Just a quick recap. So Visa's VAMP program is a major shift in how merchants will be monitored for fraud and disputes. We heard already the finding will only happen in the September for now, unless there's more backlash. But very important to stay compliant, to maintain your merchant account in good health. And here at FlexPay, we want to be a partner for our merchants so they can be good stewards of the payment ecosystem. If you enjoyed this content, please grab a copy of our guide, which has been vetted by Jeff, so you know it's legitimate. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us directly. We'll be sharing a recording of this session along with key takeaways. Oh, I see Jared is asking, can you clarify CDRN and RDR included in VAMP? Wow, it's getting into the weeds.
No, this is a fine question. So Jared's question was, CDRN and RDR, are they included in VAMP? TC40 versus TC15. So TC40 is the fraud chargeback, and the TC15 is a non-fraud chargeback. They're including TC40s. So TC40s count towards your VAMP ratio if they come through CDRN or through RDR. The TC15s do not. Now, this was a change as of 2 weeks ago. Can they change their mind again? Of course. I think this is likely where it's going to end, though. I think from Visa's perspective, including the fraud is what they're looking for, and excluding the friendly fraud, I think they're fine with. So that's how I see it coming out.
Great. And Yusuf would like to have access to the resources via email. Yeah, we'll send those over, no problem. Or you can click on the banner. There's a middle picture, and you can get your guide. So a huge thank you to Jeff for teaching us about VAMP, and to all of you for joining in such large numbers. We'll see you around. Thank you.
Bye.